Hi, I am Herman Peren. I'm from Jepper in Rotterdam, and I want to talk something. Want to tell something about using Doctrine object relational mapping in Joomla. I did this presentation at Jane Beyond at the 1st of June, but unfortunately the first part of the presentation, the recording crashed. So let's try again some home recording. I make custom extensions for Joomla, and what I often encounter is when I have a one-to-many and many-to-many relationships, that it is a bit tricky to do that nice in Joomla. But first, you remember Flipper? Under
the sea, everyone loves the king of the sea. Never so kind and gentle is he. Tricks he will do.
Or in Holland, in Dutch. Or in Germany, they sang it in German. But more about Flipper later. First, what is object relational mapping? What is how can you use Doctrine2 object relational mapping package? How could you use that to build Joomla extensions? What did I learn from that? Maybe for some possibilities to improve Joomla's core. When you model a piece of reality, you take parts of the reality and you try to put them into objects, and those objects are formed together your domain model. And so that's domain-driven design, Eric Evans, good book. When you want to persist those objects to a database, where is it? Yep. To database tables, then you have to match those objects and those tables together. So that is the mapping between the objects and relational tables. That can be very, so it's always about mapping objects and tables. In Joomla, that mapping can be very simple. Most of the time it's just you have it's very straightforward. A table row, that is an object, that is an item. A table row is an article. A table row is a web link. A table row is a user. So they are very much one-to-one related. All those fields in such a row are normally in a relational database, they are normally atomic fields. That means only one value is stored in such a field. That's the first normal form. You remember, only atomic fields. In Joomla we often do that a bit different. Then we often try to use JSON strings, for instance, to put multiple values in one field. But normally in a relational database you have only one value in one field. If you want to have that different, it is possible, but that is where the problem comes to do that in Joomla. Because normally a user can have multiple addresses, or an order can have multiple order lines, etc. If you put a mapping layer in between, the database and the objects, you can more easily map all those associations. You can say, okay, a field in such an object doesn't have to be atomic. You could have a customer that has a relations, that has a addresses field, and the addresses field maps to another table, to an address table. That is done by the mapping layer. So you can map all kind of associations, like one-to-one, for instance, a customer and his shopping cart. It's a one-to-one relationship. You can have a one-to-many relationship, for instance, a customer that has multiple addresses, and many-to-many relationships. They're also very often, they're the most difficult. Often they need an extra table in between, or you do something with JSON fields, JSON strings, like is done with tags or with access control in Joomla. In a relational database, you put together all those keys, all those different tables with foreign keys, and you join them together. And if you, for instance, would query customers and all their addresses, they are then joined together, and you get the whole thing together back. If you would do this with objects, if you would have a field addresses in a customer object, you could say get the addresses of this customer. You get back a collection of addresses, and each address you could is another object, and you could just render that in any way you want to. You only call those addresses, if you only call those addresses when you need them, that's called lazy loading. In Doctrine you can have collections in a collection interface, and it is implemented in an array collection class. And the eager loading you get, in Doctrine you can choose for eager loading. That is when you have a query with all the customers and all their addresses in one time, you get them from the database. You can also choose to have lazy loading. It depends on your application, what is the appropriate way to do it. When a customer, let's have a look here, customer is deleted, then maybe all his addresses should also be deleted. That's called a cascading delete. The nice thing about having that in a mapping layer is that you can define such a delete here in your domain objects, and that's independent in how or that is implemented in a database. So you could even have a cascading delete defined and use MyISM instead of InnoDB. All possible because we decouple the whole persistence from the objects. If you split into layers, you put a mapping layer in between. The most important thing of layers is that you cannot jump or should not jump more than one layer further. So you can never go from the objects to the database directly. So in your model, where the objects are, you don't have any SQL then. Really, no SQL in your model. That's something new. You don't have that now in Joomla. There is almost no model without SQL. But if you do this, you put a mapping layer in between, that generates the SQL, and you just ask everything here, you query the objects, you get a different kind of model, and I think you get a clearer model, and that's one of the most important things of splitting those responsibilities. That is so nice that in that layer that interacts with the database, the mapping layer, is its responsibility is to persist those objects. Those objects don't know anything about persistence. In Joomla, you now have the JTable is an active record implementation. That means that the table rows are one-to-one related to the items here in your model, and those items do have CRUD possibilities, so that you can save things in the database because they are one-to-one related to the tables. But when you split that, when you have an object relational mapping layer in between, the objects don't know anything about persistence. You could also persist not only to a relational database, but also another database, a file system, web service, or whatever. In Doctrine, the work here in the domain layer, in your model, is done and is not persisted until you say to the mapping layer, okay, now persist the whole thing. In Doctrine, the interface from your model to your mapping layer is the entity manager. So you give the entity manager the after you have done some things with your objects, you give the entity manager the command, okay, now flush the whole thing, every change that I have made to the objects in my domain model, flush them to the database, and then they come in the database. First, the mapping layer has to know how the mapping is done. Well, in Doctrine, that mapping is done in an object, a metadata object, class metadata object, and the class metadata object can be cached in a production environment. The way you input those data in that class metadata object can be different. There are 4 different ways to input it. So often heard, I have often heard a critique on Doctrine. Yeah, but Doctrine uses annotations, and annotation means kind of doc block kind of way to input those associations, and that is directly put into the definition of the entities. But that is just one way. It is a nice way that it is possible, because you can easily see how the mapping is done for the whole entity. You have a bit of overview, but it is a bit messy to put mapping and definition of your objects in one file. That's true. But it's not the only possibility. You can also input it in an XML file, in a YAML file, even in plain PHP. You know, YAML is YML is the successor of XML, and they call it YAML. It's from the Symfony kind of, it's from the Symfony people. But you can easily use it, of course. With Composer you can use anything. I use for the mapping a visual mapping tool, but it's not free, not at all. It costs something, and then you can make a kind of ERD. It's also a kind of class diagram, but only the fields that are to be persisted are in your class, in your entity definitions. and you can easily say to where they should go to what table they should be mapped, and what associations are between all those entities. Now comes one of the nicest things, I think, of all of the whole doctrine thing, is that when you have defined your mapping info, you can generate the database schema from there. And you can also generate the entities from there. So that's one time with what I do with ORM Designer, say laying out your mapping. What fields you need that are to be persisted, and how are they put into the database scheme. So you have you can generate that from the command line, but you can also make that use that in PHP. So that's the other way around than what we do in Joomla. When we define a JTable, we are looking to the database schema from what fields do we need. Before we also had to define in the JTable the fields and also in your database schema, but now you're just looking, you're defining it once, and then you're looking here, what schema do we have? But if you would use a different database, then you would have to define a different schema again and again. So now with the mapping info defined, making a database schema from it is very nice, because you only have to define once what your schema is, and it will be generated for the database you are using at that moment. I like it very much. Well, till now we only talked about the one-to-many, one-to-one, many-to-many relationship, but you have another kind of relations, another kind of associations in your domain, and that is inheritance, and that can be mapped to tables too, and it can be done in different ways. You could, for instance, say for instance you have an abstract class, say core content, and that abstract class can have several subclasses. For instance, article, web link, contact. All the common behavior is in the superclass, and all the special behavior is in the subclasses. You could map that all to one table. If all your classes or all the subclasses only differ a little bit, that is a good thing to do. But most often you use one of the other possibilities. In Joomla, in fact, we use a concrete table inheritance. All the common class, all the common properties are also in the subtypes. So if you have a web links table, all the common fields are in it. If you have a contact content type, all the common fields are in it. That's called a concrete table inheritance. So the abstract class doesn't have its own table. You could do something, and that is a bit like what is now proposed for the unified content model, the UCM, is to have to give the abstract class their own table, a core content table, to put the common things in it. Here you see these are pictures from Fowler's, Martin Fowler, patterns of oh, that's a different one. Martin Fowler, patterns of enterprise architecture, enterprise application architecture. that's a bit the basics of all the object relational mapping, the theoretical basis. When you would have an abstract class player and concrete classes footballer and cricketer, then you have here only the footballer and the cricketers. They have their own table. And you could even extend even more and get another concrete class, but only the concrete classes have their own table. You see, player doesn't have its own table. You can read here for player, you can read core content, object, and an article, and a web link object, etc. And maybe so, if this would be an article object, then this is an article with some special things to it. You could even inherit a level deeper. But the most important thing, the abstract class doesn't have its own table. Only the concrete tables have their own table. So all the common fields that are used, like here name, that are used in the abstract class, they are in all the different tables. In a class table inheritance, the abstract class here player does have its own table. So that is what is now worked out in the UCM, Unified Content Model, that the core content has its own table. What is so nice about this is that it is possible to define a unified content model with the existing database tables. You don't need, I don't say you should, but it is very good to realize that you could use the same tables as we have now without a core content table to implement a core a unified content model. That's very exciting, I think, because now you have a difference between the different responsibilities of persistence of those common properties and the implementation of it, the persistence of it in different tables. You could define, you don't have to define relational database in this mapping layer. You could also use it to map to a NoSQL database. For instance, in Doctrine you have Doctrine ODM to map to, for instance, Mongo database, or for instance OrientDB. That's for instance Alessandro Odino, who is now working on the OrientDB ODM. Yeah, that's great. Then you can map those objects to a NoSQL database. You say, oh, well, why would you need a mapping layer for that? Well, that's for the transparent persistence. Those objects don't know anything about persistence. That's the responsibility of the mapping layer. You could even mix, there's an example in the cookbook of Doctrine project that gives an example of mixing MySQL and MongoDB. I told you that where are we? Here. I told you that in your model you don't use SQL because you don't jump 2 layers further. But you can query those objects. For that, a query language was devised, and it's called Doctrine Query Language. And that Doctrine Query Language looks exactly like SQL, but it's very it's only in your domain model. It doesn't have anything about foreign keys. Foreign keys is database language. How they are connected, that's not so interested. It's more about that a customer can have multiple addresses. So what you do here, select the customers and the addresses, all fields from the customer object and all fields from the addresses object. From the customer and join it with the addresses field in the customer and call that the A field. Well, a good documentation in Doctrine. If you want to get started, read the Getting Started with Doctrine to get the feel of it. There's a nice example of a bug tracker, how you could do that, how you could define your entities, and it's the same example as is used in the design framework. And the cookbook gives some very practical examples. If you want to use Doctrine for Joomla extensions, you can easily install it now via Composer. Everybody uses Composer, of course. If you don't, it should be the first thing to look at. It's so easy. You just give one require line in your composer.json, and you have the whole stuff and all dependencies. For instance, of Doctrine object relational mapping depends on two packages: Doctrine common and Doctrine database abstraction layer. There were 2 articles of Paul de Rij. They were also published in the Joomla Community magazine, and the first one was about how to use Joomla. Well, that's even now simpler now, because in that time we only had pair or download the zip. You have to define a bit less than in that time, and he also gave an example of how to use binding with Doctrine. Normally in Joomla we add a prefix. Well, you have a nice event system in Doctrine, and you can add a prefix. And how to do that, you can see that in the latest cookbook. Of course you get all the configuration stuff from the Joomla configuration, so then you know how the database should be connected and what the database prefix is. But to make it a bit simpler, I will provide, and that seems to be a recursive function, I will provide next week a small package to put that all together, so you can simply play with it. And then the latest Doctrine will be installed in libraries Doctrine, and I will work that out a bit. You get a model, Jooctrine model I've called it, and in that model you extend your model from Jooctrine model, and you have the entity manager with this entity manager. I only use one model in my component, my domain model, and I put all the entities in it and all the relations between it. And then I have several views to use that one model. And I think that's a very nice way to use MVC. Yet another MVC. Here's an example of me using a view with Doctrine, and the most important thing is it is a combination of a edit view. You see here name and alias and a description, and a list view. This is these are performers. This is a performer, one performer, Bang, DDoS, 10 theater, and they have 3 acts. Those acts can also be further edited. they have a name and an alias and description and pictures and videos, etc. So it is a nested thing. Acts are part of the performers, and every act can have 0 or more pictures, and every act can have 0 or more videos and can have a description, etc. That way of nesting is very clear. It's much. If you would define this in Joomla, you would get all kind of loose screens. You don't see you don't have the overview of which acts belong to which artist, or you must make categories of those artists. But then it's hard to add 1 or more pictures or videos to that category. You know, that is so. What I came across making those Joomla extensions with Doctrine is that it is very easy to use and it has great possibilities, but it is so essential in Joomla that if you have one table row and that is related to one entity with atomic fields, so you define singular and plural views, that is so much everywhere in Joomla. And all kind of things don't function anymore. Like, for instance, here, those published fields and ordering fields, because you have multiple listings and you can only have one listing in the normal way. Those toolbars don't function anymore because they don't know what to throw away if you click on something here or something there. It's all a bit messy. That has to be reworked. I have done it for this, but I'm working on it to make that a bit more general. So you change a basic building block and a lot of things are changing. Is it hopeless? No. I think one of the conclusions we had at J and Beyond also was that we should build a second tower here with the new basic building blocks. Don't change the basic building blocks in the existing Joomla. Just build the new things parallel to the existing ones. And that's what we're going to do. So are there any possibilities from what I learned to improve Joomla's core? Yes, really. You know that those hierarchies and nested associations that you would otherwise do with table nested, I think they can be much more clear and much more obvious when you do that, when you model that structure in your model. And fields can be objects, and those objects can be collections of other objects. You could make a unified content model with that, where the mapping and the structure are separated. You could have structure like all those hierarchies. You could put that structure in a model and not in the view, as it is often done with HMVC. That's what I call HMVC misuse. You can have better object-oriented programming that goes beyond the database normalization. Well, let's a bit more about that. When we were used always to model the to make a data model first. First, all the tables, the relations between the tables in your relational database. Then we were making all kinds of software that operates on those data. I think sometimes that became very messy because you have a huge amount of tables that were interrelated, and then all kinds of software operating on all that data, yeah, that became a mess. But that's the core of object-oriented programming. When you have those data and you have that software, you should not separate them. They belong together. You can't have any software without the data. You can't have any data that's useless without software operating on it. So the core of object-oriented programming is that you should always have them together in a small, isolated unit that you can unit test, that you can that are building blocks without any spaghetti in between. Well, you remember from the start we had a bit about Flipper.
We call him Flipper, faster than
Yeah. So what I showed at the beginning was the Flipper song in different languages, and that's something I could explain to anybody. Even my mother would understand. What were you doing? Yeah, we were singing the Flipper song in different languages. But if I would say the same thing as how it is implemented in Joomla, well, we all have different songs and they are associated with a unique key, then maybe she would think I have done something wrong in the education of that boy. Well, okay. That is so what I want to say is you can make it clearer by making a clearer model, and that is also what I want to say. You know the Poutsma principle. Poutsma principle is, if I don't understand it, there must be something wrong. We should always strive to make things clearer. To make you could also do it with the same things very difficult. It doesn't say it is wrong, but it is very hard to maintain. And if we make things simpler, they will be easier to maintain. Well, thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please email me.